to Align International University's author event. We're speaking with Nina G., the author of Stutterer Interrupted. Nina G. Is a comedian who has appeared all over the United States and has written a book called Stutterer Interrupted, which is her story of her rise as a comedian and working in education as well. And without further ado, we're going to have Nina go ahead and speak, and then we're going to do a Q&A afterwards. And what I'm asking everybody is that they go ahead and put their questions in the comments area, and then we'll read them off to Nina at the end of the presentation. And while we're recording, we're going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll open it up afterwards. We'll unmute the cameras and then let you talk to Nina yourself. So go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Dean. And I really appreciate, Dean has always been super supportive of my comedy for 10 years almost that he's known about it, because I did keep it secret for a while. But he was one of the first people to know about it, and he's always been very, and actually, no, he's a big comedy nerd. So we've always talked so much about it, and we have similar tastes. I think you're a little more British than I am. I'm not very British at all. That's in part because I have a central auditory processing disability, and in the 80s, Monty Python was not captioned, so I really couldn't understand him very well. So I didn't get a whole lot of Monty Python back then, and it's hard to catch up now. But Dean, we have talked about doing this, and then the pandemic hit, and we're like, oh, this is easier than we thought. So we appreciate you being here. And Dean very early heard about my book. I think I even consulted with him when I was looking for publishers. It is a memoir about my experiences as a person who stutters, but the subtitle, which is a good chunk of the book, is Stutterer Interrupted, the comedian who almost didn't happen. And it tells this story about my experiences having a disability, both stuttering and having dyslexia and other types of learning disabilities. And for me, I've loved stand-up comedy my whole life. Like, I have loved it longer than I have stuttered. Like, it has been since I was a little kid. And like for example here, I've never done a book reading in my kitchen, but I have props now. See this sock puppet here? This sock puppet's name is Edith Ann. And Edith Ann I made in 3rd grade. We had to make a puppet. I loved this puppet so much that it was worn on my teddy bear's hand that I slept with. So I slept with this puppet for probably entirely way too long. And it was named Edith Ann after the namesake of Lily Tomlin. And Edith Ann was one of Lily Tomlin's characters. And if you see it very closely right here, it is signed by Lily Tomlin. I had her sign my sock puppet, which was, oh, it was so great. And that was since I was 8 years old. And I'm still into those same things that I loved back then. It's a first fan letter that I ever wrote was to Emo Phillips. Oh, and also I have the chat box open here. So if any of you are like, oh, Emo Phillips, I love his joke about the Rorschach test, like, please put those in here, because I really want that interaction, and I'd love to hear and see. As a comedian, the thing that I miss the most right now is that relationship of the audience. And I think as somebody who's trained as a psychologist, I have my PsyD. I know how important that relationship is. So that's what I miss. So if I could get a little ounce of that in the chat box, I'd love that. So my love of comedy was lifelong. And when I was around 11 years old, I wanted to be a stand-up comic. And I would read books about it. I would watch everything I could about stand-up comedy. But I wrote material. Actually, here, I'll show you some of the material that I wrote on this slideshow. I'm gonna go around a little bit everywhere. Yeah, that's me as a baby. Okay, that's me on the first day of school, but we're gonna skip that. Okay, so this yellow pad here was the jokes that I wrote when I was in high school. I know some good stuff, like I'm Italian American and I have the armpits to prove it, which during the pandemic, that is true. So there were certain things like that I wrote. And then my dream was always to perform in front of an audience, and I would call up open mics all the time. And the open mic that I called this one night was at Dorsey's Locker, and Dorsey's Locker was an open mic that ran for years and years and years and years. It was on Shattuck in Oakland. And so I was calling up all these open mics and taking notes, like tedious notes on when they were and where they were and if they allowed minors. And this one night when I called up Dorsey's, I asked if they allowed minors, and the bartender on the other end yells out to the rest of the bar, "This bitch wants to be Eddie Murphy." And I hung up the phone scared because he knew my secret. The bitch really did want to be Eddie Murphy. And that was one of those experiences that I had. And here I have that. It was around that time when I was 16. That's me in my late night with David Letterman shirt. I loved Dave back then. When he went to CBS, not so much. But anyway, that love of comedy went through and through in many ways. I'm going to go ahead and do this so I can look at your stuff. But I never got up on stage. And it wasn't because of the bartender at Dorsey's, which, by the way, I did end up going back to Dorsey's, doing the open mic for a number of years, and eventually headlined a show there, which I told them this story. But it wasn't that I couldn't find an open mic. It was the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 80s or early 90s. There were a ton of open mics. It wasn't that. It was because I'm a person who stutters, and I didn't think someone like me could be a stand-up comic. So there was a long time that I turned my interest in comedy into more of the academic realm. And when I look back at my papers in community college, I wrote papers on the First Amendment and stand-up comedy. And when I went to graduate school, I took Philip Cushman's psychology of history class, and I wrote this amazing, I thought it was amazing. Now that I look back, I don't know, but I thought it was an amazing paper on the social psycho aspects of masculinity for the Marx Brothers, for Jerry Lewis, and for Lenny Bruce. So what was their time like, and how were they a reflection of their time and a manifestation of what we thought men were back then, or also cultural issues too, because the Marx Brothers came from an immigrant experience, and that was reflected in their comedy a lot. And Lenny Bruce, who's up here, that's a poster that I bought when I was like 21 in North Beach. It was there was this great, this is how I know I'm old, because I'm like, North Beach used to be so cool, now it's not as cool, but there was this really great poster shop on the corner of Columbus, and I bought that there. It's my interest in comedy turned more academic. But when I was 36, so this is over 10 years ago now, I went to a conference for people who stutter, and that was an amazing conference. And I had been to one years earlier, and what the impact on me at that time was like, oh, if I wanted to be a teacher, I could be a teacher. Then I spent some time in a third grade classroom and quickly learned I did not want to be a third grade teacher. So I turned more to psychology. And what my job was for many, many years, and still is as a counselor at a community college now, but I've always worked in accessibility at the college level, and that's what my dissertation was about. But when I went to that conference, and so I was comfortable within my job to a certain extent, but when I was at this conference, I realized how much I was holding myself back in multiple ways, and how much the stuttering had impacted me. And there is a theory from Joseph Sheehan, who, let me play it here. He said that stuttering is like an iceberg, and that what you all see is the very top. You see our stutter, and our stutter may sound like a block. So that would be something like that. Where sometimes, and most of my stutters are repetitive. Just like that. That was perfect timing. They say that people who stutter don't have good timing, but that, I think, is a good example that we do. And so that's what you all see. But what Sheehan said was that underneath the surface of the water, there it tells another story. And this story is the feelings that are associated with stuttering. And he said that these feelings included denial, shame, anxiety, guilt, fear, hopelessness, and isolation. And that those feelings were a big part of my stuttering story, and how I carried that around. And when I was at the conference, I realized how much space I had relinquished to other people, that I was allowing them to talk, that I was allowing space with them, and giving them and giving up my space there. And that wasn't only in conversation, but that was emotional space, it was psychological space, it was friendship space, it was so many different aspects there. And I came back from that conference changed. And part of that change was because I reframed what I thought about my stutter. So instead of denial, there was acceptance, shame to pride, anxiety to kindness to myself as well as to others, guilt to comfort, fear to courage, hopelessness to hope, and most of all, isolation to community. Being reflected by a community of people who stutter, I saw how much I had held myself back. And throughout the next months, I would make changes in my life. And my friend Michelle, Dr. Hernandez, is here, and she knows some of those changes that we're not going to get into right now, but she knows exactly what they were, and she can't even hide it on her face. She knows them so well. And so those changes happened, and within 6 months after that conference, I was starting a new life. And at that time, I was like, okay, what is the thing that I wanted to do? And what that thing was to do comedy. And that is, and that for me was the thing that I really, really wanted. And that's what I went toward. And that was 10 years ago this past March. And I've been doing comedy ever since. So I wanted to read to you from my book just a little bit now that you have an introduction, and then we'll go into Q&A. Okay, what am I doing here? A bunch of things popped up and I want to make sure. Okay, it's been upgraded by the host. Good. Okay. And thank you for the chats. I'm focused on talking. As a dyslexic, it's hard to read and talk at the same time, even more than most of you. But I appreciate those. I'm going to get to those. Okay. So this is from my book. This is from the Brainwash. And the Brainwash was a cafe, a laundromat, and an open mic all at the same time. It was in south of Market. The Brainwash had a mic going on 2 or 3 nights a week, but Thursday was the big one, the Sunday service, if you will. Thursday nights were hosted by Tony Sparks, aka the Godfather of San Francisco. He was the pastor of this degenerate church, leading the crowd through another mass. I had seen Tony at a show 15 years before I even called myself a comedian. So I knew his legend long before I signed up for my first set at the Brainwash. If it was your first time at the Brainwash, Tony would tell you to put a star next to your name. Your turn to perform, Tony would scream at the top of his lungs. Tony, this is him. Hey, good humans. Your next comedian is new to the room, so what do we give them? And then the audience would say, a lot of love. And if this was live, I would make you say it, but I'm not going to now. And Tony would say, say louder. And the audience would say, a lot of love. And then Tony would say, that's right, everyone. I want you to lose your fucking minds for insert frightened newcomer's name here. And on that cue, the gathered assortment of comedians, Google worker bees, and confused laundry patrons, because there were many of those, would erupt into applause. The loudest your average open mic performer would ever probably hear. The crowd's enthusiasm then diminished as they watched the first-time performers fumble through their badly written material and realized, wow, this is actually hard. After 5 underwhelming minutes, Tony would get back on stage and act like he had just seen the greatest talent in the history of stand-up, then forget about them 2 seconds later and bring up the next act. Just like that, another congregant had been baptized into the Church of San Francisco Comedy by Tony Sparks. And it goes on, and the chapter goes on to when I met my now husband there. He was a more experienced comic, and there was a new comic who had just gone on, and Tony kind of pawned this new comic off on this veteran. And so I overheard them listening. And veteran comics are not usually nice to new comics. So the fact that he was being nice and patient was something that was like, oh, that is weird. What's going on here? So I was playing pinball. Also, you should all know I'm an expert pinball player. I'm world ranked. If you see NAG, NAG on any pinball, that is because that is me. I'm extremely good. I was at the Hall of Fame pinball place in Las Vegas, and I was playing pinball, and sometimes I don't play with my shoes on. I say that I'm the Natalie Merchant of pinball. Only Dean will understand that. And someone's like, you're really good at this. You're like the first percentile. And I took stats with Dr. Paul Warner, so I knew what the first percentile was. And so he thought I was just incredible at pinball. Then he also asked if he could massage my feet, which I didn't. I was like, yeah, I'm really good, but you're not touching my freaking feet. So anyway, I was playing pinball, and I overheard this whole conversation between this veteran comic and the new comic. And I went over to them and joined in the conversation. And as soon as the new comic left, I asked the veteran comic, are you a special ed teacher? Because you showed a lot of patience right there. And myself being someone who was in resource room and having an IEP and special ed, like you can kind of identify people and you know. And Ethan was this comedian's name, and he was not a special ed teacher, but he did teach adults who had disabilities at the time. Anyway, I'm going to read from this again. On November 5th, 2016, 3 days before Trump was elected, so that was interesting, Ethan and I were married at the Madonna Inn. Now, indicate if you've been to the Madonna Inn other than Michelle, because she was at the wedding, so I know she was there. Anybody else? Madonna Inn? Madonna Inn is amazing. If you must go just to go into the men's room, okay? Because the men's room is a waterfall. So it's a urinal has a waterfall. So when you pee in it, it flushes away by a waterfall. You have to go. Women are in there more than men. It's so amazing. Okay, anyway, the Madonna Inn. My bridesmaids were my closest friends, Gina, Heather, Jody, and Mean Dave. Heather and Mean Dave were both people who I met at the Brainwash and grew close to. Even though they were all talented writers, they elected Dave to give the bridesmaid speech. Dave begins raising his glass. I hate weddings. If you told me when I started stand-up comedy at the Brainwash that in 6 years I'd be a bridesmaid at a wedding, saying the wedding toast to two aspiring comedians from that very same open mic, I would have quit comedy right then and there. The Brainwash wove our lives together in ways none of us could have predicted. You might have noticed that I keep saying Brainwash in the past tense. Sadly, it was forced to shut down in December of 2017, another casualty of the changing culture and economics of San Francisco. So I go on a little bit about that the comedians were still going there on Thursday nights to the front, and they would do like live Facebook feeds just because they missed it so much and it meant so much to them. If you know San Francisco comedy, there used to be the Holy City Zoo, and Robin Williams would go there a lot, Kevin Meaney, and a lot of other people that were that kind of came from the San Francisco scene. So this was our Holy City Zoo. And I go on. Memories were made and lives were changed. Countless friends exist because of the Brainwash. The careers of famous and unfamous comedians exist because of the Brainwash. This book that perhaps you will hold in your hands because you can buy it at your local bookstore or Amazon, but hopefully your local bookstore, exists because of the Brainwash. Not bad for an open mic in a laundromat. So that is the little bit that I wanted to share from my book. And in part, I share that because I know people oftentimes focus on the stutter, and I focus on the stutter, but I wanted to make sure that my identity of who I am as a comic comes in first. And with that, Dean, I see some things on the chat, but I'm going to open it up to you and we can start the Q&A. So thank you everyone for being here and for listening to part of my story.
Okay, great. Can you disable your share screen?
Oh yeah, good idea.
Okay.
Dean thinks of everything. My God. Okay, there we
All
go.
right. Very good. All right, so I just wanted to go over some questions with you because I have a lot. It's been a while since you and I talked, so I'm actually kind of anxious to talk to you about a few things. And the one is the thing that's on the top of my mind is your comedy time capsule, because you've become kind of an archivist, and you created an online archive of comedians, which I think is very exciting. So can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because I want to know more.
Yeah, so as I'm sure many of you are experiencing, you probably had some more free time on your hands than you expected. And for me, a lot of the gigs that I had, like I was supposed to go to the University of Washington last month, that gig dried up. I was supposed to talk at some conferences. Those gigs dried up. So besides losing money, I also lost the ability to go out, to do mics, to do shows, to do conferences. So with that extra time, what I did was I thought I've been thinking a lot about comedy throughout this, and stand-up comedy to me is an interesting art form and business because it's only been around modern day stand-up has only been around, I'd say, since like 1958. It's people like Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce and Dick Gregory who pushed comedy into what we know it now. Henny Youngman and some of those guys from like the post-vaudeville guys, you could say, were a part of stand-up, but they didn't do it in the way that modern stand-up does. So with that being such a new art form, this is our first pandemic. Like, people have been going and drawing in caves forever. No one's told jokes exclusively, just jokes. No singing, no dancing, just telling dirty jokes to an audience. This is a new art form. So this is our first pandemic. We didn't have the Black Plague. Out of the Black Plague came the Renaissance. And so would there be a Renaissance after this? I don't know. I don't know how comedy is going to change after this. And so I wanted to get the oral history and the social history of what comics are going through now. And so what I've done is I interviewed different comics. Some, it's their first year of doing comedy, and the pandemic totally hijacked that experience, and I find that totally interesting, because how do you develop that? I've talked to comics who are in India, and what is the comedy scene like there, because their comedy is like 20 years old, and so how do you develop that voice online? And also talking to people who have clubs. I spoke to DNA, who has the DNA Comedy Lab in Santa Cruz, and that was really interesting to hear his perspective. He has a master's in transpersonal psychology, so he comes at this in a very, very different way than someone who just is like, I want to make some extra money and get free drink tickets, because sometimes you're paid in free drink tickets. Getting these different perspectives has been really interesting, and I don't know where it's going to go, but I approach, it's like you kind of go back to what you know, and what I know is how to, after 4.5 years of grad school and being in academia for all these years, I know how to intellectualize something. So I went back and I intellectualized comedy, and that's how I'm spending my days now.
It's such a wonderful resource, because I just unearthed some old comedy albums I had from the 50s and early 60s, and they're pretty rare. And when you think about all the different TV shows that have been lost, that were on Kinesoscope, that were lost in fires, like the Steve Allen stuff, you can't access it. A lot of the early Jack Parr, you can't access it. So much of it's gone. So, I mean, I think it's it's so ephemeral. And comedians, you know, if they're not recorded in some capacity, you don't get, I mean, you could write stuff down, sure, but how are you going to translate timing, delivery, all that in a transcript? It doesn't really work. So I think this is exceedingly important what you're doing. It's really, really needed. So, I mean, you're right at the right time too. So, you know, thank you for this. It's amazing. As somebody who loves archives and archival materials, I'm just really excited about it. So I hope it really takes off and a lot of people see it because it's really wonderful. I also wanted to ask you about what is your take on disability studies as a discipline? I know we have a lot of educators here and people who work with this. So I wanted to talk to you about that and your work with disability studies.
I think I want to talk about disability studies in terms of doing comedy. Because, oh, and I wrote a little chapter in the book, the encyclopedia of disability. I forget like the full name, but it's some big name. And the one that I wrote on was disabled comedy. And I have a CD, it's not a CD, it's a download. And it's an album of, and it's called Disabled Comedy Only because it was the first compilation album ever done of just disabled comics. And part of that came out of my work with the Comedians with Disabilities Act. And that was a group back then. It consisted of Michael O'Connell and Steve Danner and Eric Me, and from there it just grew to other comics. And so that group helped to give me that voice that I learned in disability studies. I think one of the core things in disability studies is that the problem with having a disability isn't on the person, but it's on the environment. And that to me is that key part in true disabled comedy is where is the focus. If I made fun of my stutter, then I would say that that is not disabled comedy. That is comedy for able-bodied people to look at and be like, oh, good, I can laugh at this joke that I want to laugh at and feel comfortable because I'm not being challenged. And my influences in comedy are people like Richard Pryor and Dave Chappelle and Paul Mooney and Wanda Sykes, who taught me about culture and race and challenged my ideas around racism and prejudice. And so taking from what I learned from them, I wanted to do comedy in that same way of challenging ableism. And for example, one of my jokes is, and this I think kind of gives you a good sense of how disability studies can come up like this. And my joke is, I'm part of the Comedians with Disabilities Act, and it includes a guy who uses a wheelchair, another guy who's blind, and another guy who's a little person. And people come up to me all the time and they say, you know, Nina, so stuttering and dyslexia, those aren't real disabilities. You should be in that comedy troupe. And I tell them, if you look at the definition of what a disability is, it is a physical or mental impairment that substantially results in having to deal with assholes. So that is one example of one of my jokes that helps to denote that the problem with having a disability isn't in me, but it's the attitudes of other people and the barriers we face. And when I tell that joke to a mostly able-bodied audience, I go, okay, ha ha ha. But when I tell it to a disabled audience, they're like, yeah, that's it, that's exactly it. And it's also a mislead if you're a comedy nerd and want to know how that breaks down. Mislead right there. So for me, that same thing so when I write a disabled joke, I think about the models of disability that I've learned and trying to express those through jokes. So that is just one example of what someone can do. So disability studies shouldn't be ghettoized in a department that is not related to psychology or bioethics or sociology or art. It should be infused into everything, just like queer studies in just like the diversity in general. It is an integral part of everything. And I think in the field of psychology, it is embedded in there because the medical model has been so in psychology that we really need to question that and to tease that apart.
You touched on something a few minutes ago that made me think of your other book. We talked a lot together about
this one right here.
Okay, very, very perfect. Thank you.
Once Upon an Accommodation.
Yeah, Once Upon an Accommodation is a very important book to me. I wish, you had gone back in time and written it about 30 years ago, unfortunately, and maybe, 40 years ago, but, you didn't. So
I was 8 or 7.
But luckily you wrote it enough that, well, still, you could have wrote it. It was very important for me because it helped me deal with my son who had to go through the school system with learning disabilities and is still going through college with learning disabilities. And also just myself, I have ADHD and I have dyslexia, and just dealing with this my whole life, and especially in college, it's such a needed and important book. And you wrote it with fellow comedian Mean Dave. Can you talk about it a little bit? Because I think it's probably one of the most important books we have in our library. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it's in part based on my experience working with adults who learn that they have dyslexia or other kinds of learning disabilities. And in it, there is a young person, Matt, who finds out that he has dyslexia, and it just goes through understanding it, and that it's not that you can't do stuff, it's that you have these talents that are specific in a certain area, and how to bring those out and how to advocate. And what an accommodation is and what it's not, because I think that is a really important thing to understand. One of the things, there's a picture of, because a lot of times in the learning disability world, people are like, well, it's not like I use a wheelchair. I just have a longer time to take when I read. And like, to me, what that says is I don't want to identify with the person who I think has a more stigmatized condition than I do. So I'm going to say, I'm not that, I'm this. That's not helpful. That just separates us. And for me, I think in part because I had multiple disabilities, and my dad is hard of hearing, I didn't have that hurdle to identify with. I had friends who had disabilities, and even though there was some shame, I eventually got over it, but Michelle could probably talk about this stuff a lot more. Whenever me and Michelle hang out, some nonsense happens, which is a whole other book, and some of that is in this book here. I just had to say that. Anyway, in the book, it talks about how to accept and celebrate and advocate. And there is a workbook in the back, and the workbook can also be found at ninagcomedian.com for a free download. ninagcomedian.com. And I think it's under the book section. And I hope with that, even if you don't buy the book, that you use the workbook, because it offers a script for a kid or an adult to understand what they have, what in terms of a disability, also in terms of what their skills are, and to celebrate those, and to be able to explain it and to ask for an accommodation. You know, like I spent a lot of time trying to read on my own. Then when I went to college, I got books on tape. Now it's books on my phone, and I read like this. There is no accommodation for advocacy. And I think that is one of the most important things that we can teach kids.
It's so important to me because I think people, they see it as us just having a minor inconvenience and overplaying it. But if, like for me, for instance, I have such a severe issue with mathematics that I was concerned myself about not being able to get my degree, which would have affected me professionally. And, you know, that's a big thing for me, at least. And then, you know, it affects your ability to get a job. It affects your, you know, wholesale, you know, any kind of learning disability can affect how you get hired, your ability to do your job. You know, we have to be very, you know, concerned about these things. And in education, your ability to take classes and tests. I don't know how many times I've had reports from my son who's going to college about how instructors complained about having to give him accommodations. And it's something that's very present for all of us that go through it. You know, we have to deal with it, but, you know, people that don't have to deal with it, they're like, oh, you're overemphasizing it, or you're making too much of it. How do you feel about that?
You know, it is just part of the process. Like, you know, it's whenever a young person starts to identify with a certain aspect of themselves, then like that thing works into every single conversation. And yeah, that's okay if that happens. That's just part of it. And I think we need to give people room to integrate every aspect of themselves. And but you know, in accommodation, like I wouldn't have gotten through school. I wouldn't have gotten my doctorate if I didn't have computers, if I didn't have accommodations, and if I didn't have people who had advocated for me in the past, so that I could internalize that and then have a model to do that when things got rough. Because things are going to get rough, because people are going to tell you you can't do it. People are going to say that the way that you do it is not a valid way of doing it. And I even get that now. I think some comics think that I'm getting by on like, oh, she's the stuttering comic. No, I have jokes about my last gynecological appointment too. I'm not going to do them here. Don't worry about that. But I'm well-rounded. And that's not what the joke is about. But that is something that I feel that we, you know, it's a common thing, and people just need, like, yeah, sometimes we're going to make it a thing and sometimes not.
Speaking on people downplaying disabilities, I'd like you to touch on the quick remedies people have given you for stuttering.
Okay, good. Okay, and let me kind of go backwards too, especially because Alliant does have a significance psychology school. So back in the Freud days, you know, I'm sure other times they thought there was a troll, just, you know, like the Steve Martin, the barber thing. What was that, Dean, on Saturday Night Live?
Steve Martin, barber?
It's a barber where he was the medieval barber.
Oh yeah, the medieval. Yes, yes, I remember that. Yeah.
See how much of a nerd he is? He got so excited with that.
Yeah.
And so like that was a Saturday Night Live sketch where it's like, oh, your daughter has a troll in her tongue. That's why she stutters. And that's not what they said, but I'm extrapolating. And so there's always weird things. Once the psychoanalysts came in, and people like Freud, and this wasn't necessarily Freud, but this was some of his disciples, they said that people who stutter were anal retentive and anal sadistic. And the anal retentive ones saw our words like our poop, that we were retaining them. And that's what the stutter was a manifestation of the anal retention. And so basically they said we had verbal constipation. That was the gist of it. Then there was a whole other camp. It was like, we really like this awful theory, and we want to build on this. And so they took that and did anal statistic. And what they thought was that we not only retained our words, but we love to torture our listener with our words too. So the sadistic part. And what they did was they likened us talking to throwing shit at the listener. So not exactly how I like to think about my comedy, but I admit some nights it is like that. So that is the psychoanalyst view of that, and that's like the old school one. But even up to like 2004, I was still reading articles that were pathologizing stuttering in this way. There was one that a psychoanalyst wrote. It was a case study on someone who stuttered, and the article is like, oh, it's very interesting. He stutters on my name, which is Margaret, and he stutters on mother, and he stutters on bottle. So like, oh, he must have like a boob fixation or something, you know, like some type of mother issue. Those are also bilabial sounds. So the thing is that we stutter on particular kinds of sounds. So I stutter a lot on D's. This week especially is D. Sometimes it goes to some other one. But if you stutter on bottle, you're going to stutter on baby, and you're going to stutter on m. So anytime your lips do m, then you're going to stutter. So it didn't look at that well-integrated view. So there's that piece. Now, how is that translated into current day-to-day living is, I've had people tell me, like, you know, like people love advice. They love to give advice, and it comes in many, many forms. You know, some, like once after a show, guy came up to, and this is totally true. I wish I could say that I made this up. I don't have this good of an imagination, but he came up to me and told me that I stuttered because I'm having the wrong kinds of orgasms. And I asked him what he meant by that, and he told me. And I was like, I don't think you stutter through that orifice, okay? And that's all I'm gonna say about that. But that actually happened, was that people have this thing that sex can cure. And like, that's just a weirdo at a comedy mic. But it also has happened to a friend of mine who stutters, and he was around 23 at the time, and he was a virgin, and he was seeing a psychologist. This was in the Bay Area, and the psychologist, and it wasn't for the stutter, it's for some other stuff, but the psychologist told him that once he starts having sex, guess what's gonna happen? His stutter's going to go away. It's not going to exist anymore. And the psychologist probably saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where Billy Bibbit was fluent for like a second and then wasn't. And you know, basing your knowledge on stuttering from a movie, not a great practice. That's like a paleontologist quoting Jurassic Park, or a marine biologist citing Jaws. So generally not a good practice, but that's what this person did. And so my friend, I was like, you know that this is bullshit, right? What your therapist said. And he's like, yeah, but he helps me on some other stuff, so, you know, it's fine. I just know it, and I'm going to go on. And so we had some conversations about this, but my friend, eventually he started to date a woman, and I could tell that it was going to go somewhere. And one Saturday morning, I got a text, and the text read, "I still stutter." That's right. And so I texted back, keep trying. And that actually happened, that whole thing.
I was going to ask you about how does it work for you? Because you have basically, you're like Superman and Clark Kent in many ways. You have your professional self and your comedian Nina G self. How does that integrate or work for you professionally? How does that work?
You know, I think over the years, at first I was pretty uncomfortable about it. And you were there during that uncomfortable period, as was Dr. Hernandez. But I eventually got to a place where I'm more comfortable with it. And I think I like having those two sides, because comedy is a great way to be an advocate, and people like Dick Gregory and his records up there. That's why I'm looking at it. People like him taught me what it means to be an activist, to be an advocate, and to be a comic. As he was a comedian in the 60s who was groundbreaking, but he also turned toward civil rights. And for me, that is the most integrated piece of me, is to be able to integrate that activism along with that. And the Comedians with Disabilities Act was a big piece of that.
Do you have any advice for people for young people or even adults who stutter and want to, maybe you're looking for help or want to just get some advice to, interact with other people or in the workplace?
Yeah. So first of all, I wanted to say a little bit about what stuttering is and what it's not. So we had talked about what it's not, but what it is a difference in the brain. And I believe Eric went into that very eloquently here and started to talk about that, which I really appreciate. And to kind of sum it up in my way, is that so stuttering is on the left side of the brain, right next to Broca's area. So if you've taken biology in brain class, Broca's area is the expressive part of the brain. Right next door to that is a sensitivity that people who stutter have. So when we talk, we stutter, but if we sing, we don't. If we talk in a wacky voice, then we don't. I used to be, and I am old enough to be alive at a time when we did not have caller ID. And it was such a wonderful and fun time because we could prank phone call people and no one would know because they wouldn't know who was on the other line, and it was beautiful. But I could prank phone call my friends and they'd never know because I would use a voice. Now, once I was in an EMDR class, and so many of you who are in psychology know that that is a particular intervention on how to process trauma. And in it, and what I realized in it was that when I was doing EMDR, I didn't stutter. And people in the class were like, "Ooh, it's trauma-based." No, it's not. It's that EMDR works on the right side of the brain. When we sing, when we use an accent, that is a function of the right side of the brain. And so what I went on to tell this group was that when we sing, such as Bill Withers, who recently passed away, and Mel Tillis, we are fluent. When we talk, we're not. And the example that I personally love is that Marilyn Monroe was an actress who stuttered. And that's why she talked like this. Because if you talk like this, you can trick your brain into not stuttering because you're using the right side of your head, of your brain. And so I did that accent and I did that voice. And one of the men in the group was like, oh, that's very sexy. Maybe you should talk like that all the time. I was like, nah, I'm good. I think that I'd rather stutter. But there is a focus on us having to be fixed. And I think that's one thing that I would want to tell kids is that we don't necessarily need to be fixed. If you want to work on your fluency, that is your choice and that is fine. But we don't need to be fixed. We are okay the way that we are. It's the environment that may need to learn how to be patient. And one of the interviews that I did for the Comedy Time Capsule, which was really interesting to get this perspective, and I was talking to Rudy Ortiz, who is a comedian out of San Leandro. I think you may have met him once, Dr. Hernandez. I think he may have done your birthday show. Anyway, great guy, good friend. He was telling me, because I asked him what the impact of Zoom would have on people. And he said, well, I think that people are just going to have to wait for the other person to talk because the connection isn't always good. And there isn't fluidity in the conversation. And so I think people are going to be better communicators. I was like, yeah, that's what I've been telling people to do all these years with my speech, but finally Zoom's going to, phone it in for me. And so I think this is a great training ground for people to shut the fuck up and let us talk. And so that is kind of what I hope happens. Because if we can open up the communication for us and to know that we're okay, hopefully that will internalize, because it doesn't, even when I say it, it doesn't always internalize in myself. You tend to go back to those icebergs of the past, and that's okay too, because I think it's a constant journey, and you constantly get off track and then you get back on track. But finding community was key for me, in community both in the stuttering world but also in the disability world, because Michelle, who has rheumatoid arthritis, she and me share some experiences. They're not the exact same experiences, but they are similar. And having people who reflect that, I think, is really important.
Now, when you talk to other comedians, I know sometimes, I think this is reflected on the TV show Mrs. Maisel, but sometimes comedians can be horrible to each other. What has been your experience with comedians giving you a hard time based on your stuttering? Or, if you've been on any kind of like a call-in show, have you been treated, badly? What's been your experience in the comedy world with issues of people, how they deal with your stutter?
What I oftentimes say is the difficulties that I might encounter and the discrimination that I might encounter in comedy. I have a background in academia, so I have already encountered some of those jerks, because for me, comedy, like in comedy, all people care is that you're funny. They don't care and this is generalizing, but in general, as long as you're funny, that is the main thing. And comedy is, the first time that I stepped into a comedy open mic, it felt like I was stepping back into my resource room freshman year of high school, where everybody had an IEP. It was a bunch of kids who had Asperger's and who had ADHD, mostly boys, because the special ed rooms are a lot of times boys, and comedies, a lot of boys, a lot of men. Some of the men are boys. And so there is that, it felt like a familiar thing. I find that there's been less discrimination against me in comedy than I had in academia. And I think because academia is so based on the written word. I was talking to Dahlia Malik, who is a comedian who has her law degree. She has her PhD in law. And I was asking her if there is a connection between her academic self and her comedy self. And she wanted to escape the seriousness of the academic world. And for me, that wasn't it. For me, it was the academic world never felt like it fit the way that I express myself. That because of the dyslexia, because I'm first generation college, because I don't have a very polished way of talking about academic concepts, that never fit me. I can talk about those same concepts on stage, say the F word, and that fits. And so for me, it was, I didn't always find my place in academia, but I was able to bring that into comedy. So comics, you know, they're fine. I mean, a lot of them are assholes. Like the one that I talk about in the book was once I said my name, introduced myself, said my name, and this guy said, "Is that?" And so I stuttered a tiny bit on my name. And he said, "Is that Nina with 5 N's?" And I was like, "No, that is Nina with 2 N's." And I did this. And he got a message, and it was, and that is the wonderful thing about comedy too, is that the microaggressions that you get, you can give them back. Whereas when I was in the academic world, it was like, oh, someone could be kind of shitty, and you're like, was that passive aggressive? Was that aggressive? Was it this? Was it that? And you don't know how to respond. Comedy, every single microaggression is on 10, so you can say it back in 10. And I'd much rather have that kind of environment where I can fight it out.
Excellent. I'm gonna wrap this up with the this.
And we have lots of questions over on the chat. Should I?
I want to stop the recording, and I want to open it up so that you can talk to the people attending and get to talk to everybody, and everybody get a chance to talk to their talk to you about and ask the questions. We don't have, I think, permissions for people to be on video after we record it, so I have to stop it at this point. So we're going to wrap this portion of it up. We are going to continue, and Nina will get to talk to you and answer all of your questions.
And just a couple of things that I see over here. One was that there is different kinds of levels of severity, and that can be within the same person. So sometimes it may be more, sometimes it could be less, sometimes during certain times of the month it's a little bit more. So it all depends. But the management of it, for me, I haven't been very conscious of managing my speech, but I think a lot of the interventions that are done through the American Institute on Stuttering, I think, are really some of the best, where they focus more on looking at the iceberg and approaching it from that way to know how to desensitize yourself. Because in stuttering, once you are like, I'm just gonna stutter, you are sometimes more this very weird contradictory thing. And so the American Institute for Stuttering, I think the website is stutteringtreatment.org, but I'm not sure. They offer online therapy, and they also have a lot of scholarships. So I always refer people to them, but depending on the kind of therapy you want, and it's good to shop around to find the best fit. And this is speech, not psychological. So there's also the Stuttering Foundation, and they look more at fluency, if that is what you want to work on. And I think that's fine too, wherever a person's at. For me, I learned to prolong my words like this really hard to tell a joke when you do that. So for me, I've tried to work on being a good communicator instead of being a fluent communicator, because I don't think they're the same thing.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and then we're going to open it up so you can start taking the questions and talking one-on-one with some of the participants.